just one moment while I go through my final spiel of the day. So just one moment here. So again, to those who are joining us kind of in the middle, thanks very much for joining us today for the Albert Lea Seed 2021 conference. I'm Matt Levitt. I'm an agronomist with Albert Lea Seed. And we've come to our final program of the day, which is a two-pronged discussion of ancient and heritage grains. You may have been familiar with some of these grains, heard about them, maybe even come across marketing outlets for them and been interested in the kind of attractive prices you can get, but these are definitely a little bit off the beaten path in terms of, fitting into a traditional small grains rotation, and bears more discussion about kind of what they are, where they fit, and how they can be grown in the upper Midwest. So we've got two folks, both Steve Zwinger, who's a researcher with NDSU, also a farmer himself, is going to be giving us kind of an overview of a lot of the work that he's done with Emmer, Einkorn, and Spelt. And then we've got kind of a practical background from John Wepking, Meadowlark Organics, very innovative farmer who runs his own mill, also raises a lot of different grains for kind of the milling, baking, and specialty markets. And he'll be giving us a talk kind of about his practical experience with some of these grains. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Steve as soon as I unmute him. Are you there, Steve?
Yes, I am.
Awesome. So, yep.
Hello.
I see you. Great. So you can go ahead and share your screen again, and we can get started.
Okay. Let's see here. Oh, there we go. Well, hello, everybody. As Matt introduced me there, my name is Steve Zwinger, and I'm a research specialist for NDSU. And I will say that predominantly the majority of the research that I will present today and stuff and do is going to be organic with these ancient grains. And I've worked on these for a number of years, and some of it's partially because of the history we have in North Dakota with ancient grains, and so yeah, I would like to just do a little bit of explaining about them and talking about them a little bit. And let's see here. Oh, I can't move my slides.
Yeah, ooh, Steve, if you move your mouse to the bottom left, you might be able to advance there. There was another menu that popped up here for other folks.
Bottom left?
Yep.
I don't see anything, Matt. I'm sorry. Okay.
There you go.
Oh, there we go. Never saw that before. You got Albert Lea's way ahead of everything.
Zoom keeps you on your
anyway, yeah. So, pardon me?
I said Zoom keeps you on your toes.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, so basically, again, the hulled grains, they're all wheats. The ancient grains is referring to them. They're all wheats. They're all triticum. They are the oldest forms of wheat on the planet. And so basically, when we think about these, to give you a quick explanation of them and stuff, einkorn, as you see in the middle there, that lighter colored green one, doesn't quite fill in the rows as much as is the oldest form of wheat, and it's genetically very simple. Later on in time, a few thousand years later, Emmer shows up. Natural crossing over time and stuff like that. And Emmer's a little bit more genetically complex, has 2 seeds per hull, and you can see it looks closer to what we're used to with wheat and such like that too. And then Spelt shows up later on, again, still hulled, 2 seeds per hull, but is very genetically similar to wheat. Matter of fact, it has the same number of chromosomes and everything. So, but these grains thrash with their hulls on, and that's the distinguishing difference. A couple of things that we really need to think about, considerations, and I know we touched on, but there's a lot of interest in them, and rightly so. They have some value, but there's challenges that go with them. And probably the 2 biggest things to think about, and I know John will touch on them, and others have, but it's markets, where you're going to sell them, and the dehulling aspect. So yeah. And so one of the things I want us to think about, and there's a lot, this is really a busy slide, and I'll just use it as an example, but think about, you know, climate versus wheat type, where these came from. These wheats came from all over, you know, and where you're going to grow them depends upon where you're at. If you're in a wet climate or a dry climate, you know, and I'll use the example of Emmer, for example, you know, very adapted to North Dakota because it was grown here. And again, as you see, Emmer is a new grain for the semi-arid, you know, regions. You know, so they do have a history. And again, particular Emmer, you know, our immigrant farmers, the German Russians that settled in the Dakotas, they brought that with them. The USDA saw that Emmer was a good crop, brought in seed from Russia, and did identify the Dakotas as a good area to grow them in. And so, sorry about that, folks. Just a second here. No, I don't know what I'm. Oh, yeah, I don't know what happened, Matt.
Yeah, Steve, it's that same area in the bottom left there. I think you zoomed in by accident.
Yeah, I don't. I'm so sorry here. This normally doesn't. I don't know how to get that back out.
Or what I can do is just wrest the controls back from you, and then I think if you start it again, it'll probably, if you share your screen once more, it'll probably resolve itself here. There we go. Okay, so Steve, why don't you try sharing your screen once more, and then we'll see if that irons that out.
Okay. Man, that put me right back to where I was.
Let me, you can just keep talking, Steve, and I'm going to try to queue up your backup presentation here. And then if you just want to tell me to advance, but you.
Yeah. So that's good. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And I'm sorry about this because the next slide will show the actual map that these seeds are grown in. But basically, again, you know, that's why, and I'll just kind of touch a paraphrase as I'm going here, but that's why the Emmer is been a crop, again, that was grown in North Dakota, and it was identified as a good growing area. And, you know, our farmers grew these. Now, again, they weren't growing them to sell in human food markets and stuff like that. It was livestock feed. And that's why these crops tended to continue going. So with that, can't remember the next slide here, of course. Okay, so there you go. There, thank you, Matt. Okay, so as we see here, okay, we'll go to the slide that has the map. As you can see, go one back, Matt, thank you. And I appreciate that. I guess we did need the backup. So as you can see here in 1919, this is where the Emmer was grown, and so that area in south central, north Dakota, where it was very well adapted and it works well. Now it's stretched out and stuff, but again, that's why our farmers kept growing these up until the 60s and fed on their farms. Next slide, please. And so here's so from that publication. If we look at this is some data that we're looking at. So this is in the turn, you know, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. If we look at this, Emmer did out yield at the averages, you know, over the years to barley, oats, and wheat and durum. Now again, this is measured in the hull, and these other grains are not in the hull, but that's as other data I present will be the same thing. But if we look at that, you know, they were yielding the same. Next slide, please. And if we look at that, at some data that I generated here this was on Organic Farms and Research Center. These are trial means. If we look at this, we are seeing, you know, some very similar trends that where they yield, the Einkorn, Emmer, and Spelt were out yielding in terms of pounds per acre, what the farmer would sell. But again, these were very dry years. And so next slide, please. If we if we look at this slide here, I just picked this one out. Again, it was, they were dry years, but if we look at the Carrington site in 2014, we can see a very high yielding environment. With that, these other grains are still yielding well, but not as much in comparison to Robinson, a very low yielding year, sandy site. You can see once we start getting into that low yield that the ancient grains actually will out yield under these environments. So that's just some take home. Next slide, please, Matt. Thank you. So with that, I want to just touch a little bit on the seeding rates, and you can go to the data. And I'll have to go through this quick because I'm sorry I took up time. Next slide, please. So if we look at this, there's a lot of busy information here, but I picked out this slide too to show under the high yielding environment, when we looked at seeding rates from 50 to 150 pounds, we still were increasing our yield. But the factor does come in of more increased lodging, so we need to consider that. What we tend to see with seeding rates, the lower seeding rates will have higher plant heights, more tend to have lower plant lodging and be somewhat later. Next slide. And so if we look at this over time, these foresight averages, it's pretty flat. So what we really felt from this data, that the 100 pounds will give us adequate weed control yields and be not as prone to lodging. So next slide, we'll look at the same thing with Einkorn. And here's a seeding rate. If you look at an Einkorn, that where the sign is, that's the lowest seeding rate at 50 pounds. So you can see it does compensate well. Next slide, please. So again, same data, but the one thing I really found was quite interesting is the amount of spikes per plant or tillering that Einkorn will do over Emmer. We were producing up to 7 under the low seeding rates as compared to we were like 3.1 or so with the Emmer under those low seeding rates. But again, we saw that same trend here, and actually probably even a little bit greater from low to high. And in other words, the low seeding rates with Einkorn shouldn't be used. And so we feel that 100 pounds, maybe up to 125 for a little bit more competitiveness if you are in an environment that's not conducive to lodging. But if you look at the lodging scores here, you can see it's a very, very linear trend there, that the more plants we have out there, the more they're going to lodge. Next slide, please. And so again, we see that same thing, a lot flatter when we look at the multiple sites. So again, we kind of feel that 100 pounds in that hull is the place to go. Okay, next one. I want to try to get through. So data planning, Margaret pointed this out, and I want to say the same thing here again. We did a data planning trial where we compared wheat, which is Glen, Lucille, which is Emmer, TM23, which is Einkorn. You can see we did drop our yields quite a bit by delaying planting dates. The one thing that is noticeable, the percentage in yield reduction was slightly lower with Einkorn and Emmer as compared to wheat, but still we are giving up yield. So planting dates is still important with these ancient grains, and it shows up in the next slide with test weight. You can see that's the biggest one. We're still dropping test weight, not as much with Emmer as we are with the wheat and the Einkorn, but we're still, and these are the factors that help deliver quality grain. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. So then variety selection, again, that's one of the most important decisions you can make in a farming operation that has the biggest impact, and it's probably one of the easiest decisions to make based off of good variety trial data. Now with the ancient grains, we don't have as much choice as we do with other crops, as there are limited breeding programs and variety choices. Okay, Matt? Okay, so this is the organic Emmer variety trial that we've been conducting, and you can see differences here. This was when there was many more lines I was screening. You can see that very early short one in the front as compared to others. And so we'll go to some data here. Next slide, Matt. Okay, first, we also should mention Khorasan wheat, or known as Kamut by the brand name. Now this wheat here, it's genetically similar to Emmer, and that's why I put it in the Emmer variety trial. Now it does thrash with the hull on, or excuse me, it does thrash free. So, and it's a large durum wheat looking like seed. And as you can see here, this was not a really wet year at Carrington, North Dakota, and it's already really starting to lodge just shortly after heading and stuff. And so there's a reason why this wheat is grown in the very dry regions like Montana, but I just wanted to point that out. And you'll see some data in the next slide. If we look at this, now this is just a diversity of lines. We're just looking at it again to be able to show that diversity and what's adapted and what's not. So if we look at this, the lines over on the very right that are the higher yielding ones are the ones that are being grown. And I just want to point out North Dakota Common. That is just a very, I suppose it would be called VNS, but they weren't using VNS back then, but it was one of the last commercial Emmer lines sold. But it still performs really well. And so you can see why that one hung around. If you see the Kamut there, the yield is a little bit lower. Again, these years weren't really wet, so it did a little bit better. But again, we have to think about the Kamut doesn't have the hull on. And I would also like to point out, because of diversity and stuff, the line at the very left, Debra, very early, but that is a Emmer that is free thrashing. So there are free thrashing lines out there. Next slide. This is probably the more encouraging part. So that this is now newer data. And you can see we do have still, I'm using Lucille, which is probably the line that Albert Lea is selling right now, the most common Emmer out there. And then North Dakota Common, comparing it to two newer lines that have been developed at the University of Saskatchewan and marketed through the Crop Development Center. I'd like to just point out this is basically two separate years here, 2019 green and 2020 on the right. What I want to show is those are very dramatically different years. 2019 was a high yielding year, 2020 very low yielding year. Next slide. Okay, so Einkorn, and again, you'll see TM23, that's been our check. Okay, now we'll go to the data. And again, we'll see some newer lines being developed again by the Crop Development Center. And we do see an improvement on these lines over what we've been using. So this is encouraging. And we'll jump to the next one. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, spring Spelt, next slide. Again, seeing diversity there. And again, we didn't have Spelt in 19, we just had it in 2020. Again, but we see two new lines, CDC Involve and Silex, and they did well. As particularly, we'll have a slide later on that'll show all of these trials together, but they did out yield the Einkorn and Emmer and wheat. Next slide. So again, we'll run through these are older from that same set. You can see we didn't have near the material we did now. We'll just jump to the next one. And so we need to think about dehulling. I'll just show you a little bit of the work here. So here's a typical Emmer line that we have. And if you see the kernels on the right with the hulls on the left at the top, those are the hulls that came from that kernels versus what you see on the bottom is the whole intact. So there's a lot of material there. And okay, we'll jump now to show some data. And so if we look at, there is great differences amongst all these lines on the percent dehulling. And so, but if we look, we're averaging for the most part under the methods that I use to dehull these in my lab, we're getting about 50% or so with our Emmers. And if we go to the next slide with Einkorn, we'll see that same thing, but again, a single kernel inside there, and it looks a little bit more like a soft white wheat or something like that. And now the data on the next slide, Matt. Okay, if you see here, we're about the same. As a whole, I would say Einkorn is probably a little tougher to dehull than Emmer is, and we'll go now and jump to Spelt. And again, you see that same thing. Spelt's a little bit bigger, larger, kernel with two seeds inside there. It looks much more like spring wheat. And again, the reason, if you look at that bulk, that's why the test weights of Spelt are going to be lighter than Emmer and Einkorn. Looking at the data, the most encouraging thing on the next slide here is that Spelt does dehull much greater. We're looking at these lines, and these aren't necessarily as adapted lines. I didn't dehull the new lines I have yet. But we're approaching 66, 67%, and they dehull much better. And so I would like to use this as an example. I think this is partially why we see the Spelt industry, for lack of a better way to say it, has probably been progressed more as we've been used to using that, and it's a little bit easier to handle. So I think, and also there's probably more winter types. Now again, I'm sorry I didn't mention that everything I'm dealing with is spring types, and winter types is a whole nother thing to bring up. We'll jump to the next slide. We just want to touch a little bit, I believe it goes into the heritage wheats. And what are they? Everybody's got a definition. I think the one I like to go with most is probably pre-1950s wheats. And if we look at two of them here that I've been testing, they're Mida and Series. These are both wheats that have been developed by the North Dakota Agricultural Experiment Station, or NDSU. Ceres is a early 1900s. I think it was 1909 maybe, or something like that. And Mida is a 1944. Both of them, we kind of screened a number of lines, and they showed to have some merit and value. And we looked at them just to put them in trials to compare, as so many people are niche marketing these heritage wheats. Next slide, we'll look at some data. So how do they perform? Again, so this is the last 3 years on organic trials at Carrington. So the 3-year average is, let's see, yeah. So we're looking at, I can't see the bottom of it, so I forget now. The green is going to be the lower yielding, so that's 2020, our very low yielding, with a 3-year average being the yellow. Point being is, what's kind of interesting when you look at this is that, yes, our modern varieties do outperform. There's no doubt about it. There's been breeding and work that went on. And so we use Glen and Bulls as kind of the checks I do, showed you for checks. But, so we have Mida and Ceres. You can see they are lower yielding. Red Fife, again, the wheat that everybody, knows about. And the one thing I thought was kind of interesting, if we do look at the green bars, 2020, if you notice, that variety under them extreme stress conditions performed better than some of our modern varieties. So that tells me, under some situations, some of these older varieties may have some elasticity or advantage. But if you take Red Fife in a very wet environment, it's going to lodge and have disease and stuff. So we have to need to consider that with these ancient grains. One thing I'd like to point out is DAPS. DAPS is an older, maybe about 20 years old, from NDSU, that wasn't no longer being grown for foundation seed. But the organic farmers in North Dakota liked it because it fit their needs of having, tall plant, a lot of straw, high protein. And so our farmers have been growing that, and that one does work well. And so we'll jump to the next slide to look at protein. And here we can see too, that, again, you see DAPS does have a fairly high protein. And the one thing unique about Mida that we did like, it was its kernel, very nice, large, beautiful kernel. But again, it has a good protein. So Mida had a uniqueness to it. And we did some taste testing work with it also, and it came on top. So, and another thing I just like to point out is the FBC Dillon. That's a variety that was developed by the Farm Breeding Club from Northern Plains Sustainable Ag. But if you see, that is a very low protein. The reason why I use this data and show you is here is it isn't, it doesn't have a fit for the main market to be sold to grain millers and other people, so to speak, that way. But the artisan bakers love it, and it makes a great loaf. The reason why it doesn't make it and our farmers didn't want to grow it was because its protein was too low. So I think it's a unique and interesting situation. Okay, we'll jump to the next slide. And here want to show that same type of graph that I did earlier, but with 2019 and 2020 with the more modern varieties of these crops. So if we see here, again, the 2019 year was much higher yielding. And if we look at our wheat yields, again, these are trial means, we were up at the top up there, but if we get down now to 2020, the lower yielding year, we're seeing that same trend. And what I really thought was interesting, and I would be interesting to look at it again, was what happened this year with Spelt, how it performed considerably better than our other crops. And so that'll be interesting to see how that happens again next year. And I think I have one more slide left, maybe, Matt. Yes. So that was really a quick run through, and I'm sorry I didn't get this down right by advancing them, but I'm glad Matt was able to advance it for me. And I thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries, Steve. Thanks very much for your presentation and kind of giving us an overview of these crops. And I have to kind of correct my thinking, even the titling of this presentation. If there's new breeding going on in Canada on Einkorn and Emmer, I don't think calling them an ancient grain is really appropriate anymore. Modern up-to-date grains is maybe a more appropriate term. So thanks for that presentation. I did want to mention, this may have come up already, but with these crops in terms of agronomics, dehulling is obviously very important for marketing them, but for planting seed, you want to plant these grains with the hull on. Otherwise, you get establishment issues. And Steve, there was one question. I think you may have touched on this before, but the spelts were all spring types, correct? Not winter types?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Gotcha. Great. Well, with that background, we're going to turn things over to John Wepking from Meadowlark Organics to kind of give us more of a practical spotlight into raising some of these specialty grains and heritage breeds. So John, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and we can get you going. Yeah, we've got you now. Looks good.
Okay, good. Great. So that was really great, Steve. I took a bunch of notes myself. Our farm is a bit different in terms of the climate than North Dakota. So my perspective will be a little different in terms of varieties and things like that.
Hey, John, before you go too far, I think where your mic's cutting in and out, do you want to move a little closer to your computer?
I can try. It's possible that, or I need to just holler.
Shout at us.
Is that helpful?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, good. So our farm is in Southwest Wisconsin. We do about 800 acres certified organic grain production, and then also we raise grass-fed cattle as well. The history of the farm is it was a confinement area for a long period of time.
Hey, John, sorry, your connection's still cutting in and out. Why don't you call in over your cell or landline, and then I'll just advance for you too.
I can, or let me try just getting rid of the video. Does that help? Maybe if I just talk and not have my video there.
No, it's still
better.
Yeah, it's like
still choppy.
Starts out well, and then it just like descends into nothingness.
Huh? Weird. Okay. Yeah, I'll figure out how to call. I have to find that number.
Okay. Yeah. Right on. I will drop the contact info into the chat here, and then we'll just pause for a couple of minutes while we get John set up here.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries.
Say, Matt, it's the ancient grain guys that can't figure out how to use technology.
Yeah, geez. I mean, sorry we're not hitching up the horse and plow right now, you guys.
Yeah, I saw that question there, and that's a good one. Thank you for asking that. I have not done fertility work at this point in time. In that project that we saw a lot of the work doing, they did a little bit of fertility work on the East Coast with more of the winter grains. But as a whole, definitely less fertility. I feel real confident in saying that. The exact number, I can't say that I know that. And the reason why I base that off of is that a lot of the first work that I did wasn't conventional and with a high fertility, and that stuff lodged so bad. And it really wasn't until I started looking at those lower fertility in the organic environment. Not that it's low, but you'll know what I mean, that it was. So the exact question is, I feel you could probably get by with, if you're, in a fertilizing regime, where you're fertilizing, your spring wheat, you probably can lose 25% less or more. I think they are more efficient. There's data that says that they're more efficient.
There's
Rooting structures
too about dehulling percent of these ancient grains too. Maybe you could touch on that just quickly.
Could you ask that question again, please?
Oh, sure. The dehulling percent that you presented, can you share what kind of equipment you were using? And
Oh, yeah, great, thanks.
Dehulling
Yeah,
that?
I had a Forsberg impact dehuller. And so it was a lab scale, but from what they say, it does the same thing as the big one. And so what I did was, there is no techniques or procedures for that. So I kind of made up my own. What we did is it went through as fast as we could run the thing, went through twice. And then whatever, then we cleaned it and then measured that. And so basically, I feel it was still very good to compare amongst those varieties, which ones are going to do better. But yeah, that was going through a Forsberg impact dehuller twice.
Awesome. And it looks like we've got John back here. Can you hear us, John?
Yeah, I can. I'm on the phone now, so hopefully that works.
Yeah,
Am
you
I
sound great.
coming through better?
Looks like you're driving your presentation. So yeah, full steam ahead.
Okay, sounds good. So, sorry, yeah, we're about 800 acres of organic grain in the kind of upland ridge tops of the driftless in southwest Wisconsin. We are in the process of, in the sort of late stages of building a flour mill on our farm. We've been selling flour and grain through our farm brand for the past 3+ years, partly funded by a USDA value-added producer grant, which was really instrumental in us starting this and using a local toll miller, but Lonesome Stone in Lone Rock, which actually you can see on the map, a little bit about 25 miles to the northwest of us in the Wisconsin River Valley. But Gilbert Williams, who runs that mill, is retiring. And so we're bringing the mills down from Lone Rock and starting up to mill flour here in Ridgeway in the next couple of months, which is crazy and exciting. I really wish that winter was about 2 to 3 months longer so we could get everything done before I have to start thinking about spring again. But this is a good, for some reason, there we go. Now we're moving. Our farm is in Ridgeway here. You can see on the map, it's just sort of an interesting way of looking at how our farm lies. Obviously, we're very hilly, and we're kind of, the Highway 18 is sort of a watershed divide. The land to the north all runs to the Wisconsin River to the north, and then out to the Mississippi, and everything to the south flows to the Pecatonica in Illinois. And our farm is pretty well geographically isolated. We have a lot of forest edges and a lot of slopes, so we don't have to worry too much about drift from conventional neighbors and GMO pollen and things like that, but we do have to worry quite a bit about animal damage in the crops. It's just sort of our trade-off, but it's a beautiful place to farm. A lot of our farm looks like this. So though we do raise about 800 acres, our average field size is really only probably 6 or 8 acres because of all of the contouring we do. I'll buzz through this a little bit because we're just focusing on the heritage and ancient grains, but we grow hard red winter and soft red winter and soft white winter as well. The one variety that would be considered a heritage variety would be Turkey Red, which we've been growing actually for 5 or 6 years now. We do grow hard red spring wheat on the farm, mostly modern varieties, but also red fife. We've grown most recently Danko, but quite a few rye varieties. Spelt, we've grown Sun Gold and Maverick, which are 2 varieties. I don't know exactly the full story, but there's a breeder in Ohio, and the seed is sold through French's, I believe is the company. And there's quite a few spelt lines there, mostly winter spelts. And those are the 2 that they recommended for baking quality, and they've certainly dehulled well and grown well where we are. Oat varieties, mainly newer varieties. We have grown some hullless, though that's been a frustration on the agronomic side and grain storage side. Einkorn and Emmer we have grown on the farm, though in small acres and kind of baby steps. I'm pretty much going to skip this. This is sort of just a totally bizarre graphic representation of how we've come to think about rotation, which isn't so much a rigid rotation as it is a number of different 3 to 4 year crop sequences that we really like, with corn as sort of the focal point where the rotation spins off in different directions. The Spelt is the one that we've grown the most. We've grown some acres of Spelt, all but one of the last 5 years. And most recently we haven't, just because, and this is a common refrain, the marketing has been a challenge. So we grew enough in 2019 that we didn't have to plant any this year, and we're able to hang on to what we direct market to cover 2 years. This is the first field we grew actually in 2016, and it's the Sun Gold variety. I was really impressed with the variety. It tillered pretty remarkably. I don't have exact numbers on it, but where we did have patchy winter kill in areas, I mean, the plants that remained turned into almost shrubs. All of these wheats are fairly competitive early season, I've found. We graze beef cattle and make a decent amount of grass hay, but if there are any dairy farmers out there, some of these grains, I certainly look at them and think if I had a herd of dairy cattle, they would sure make good chopped forage, or in sile well too. I think they would work well in a dairy context. But I've never done that because we just don't have enough cattle to take that experiment on. Emmer wheat, this is Lucille that we planted. I believe this was a field in 2017. You can see the weeds coming in. This is before we acquired, last year before we acquired a TINE weeder. And what was really remarkable about this field is it was grown on a hillside that has a really, really serious mustard problem historically. And we grew Emmer on one strip, and then there were alternating strips of oats above and below it on the hillside. And they were planted at the same time. And I wish I had a picture of it, but the Emmer outcompeted the mustard almost completely. And the oats were so bad that we had to mow them down just to control the mustard bloom. So it was certainly a grain that we thought did very well for weed control. This is the field at 2 other points. You can get a sense of the slope terrain we farm in too. But same field. It does, with a lot of these grains, and this could be because we're fairly well drained and windswept. I haven't had too many conditions where we had lodging that was to such an extent that harvest wasn't possible. What we tend to have is just sort of entire fields leaning at a pretty aggressive angle, so that you can still usually direct combine them or certainly swath them creatively. But they're definitely vertical enough that harvest isn't a problem. This is a field of einkorn that we grew just this last year. We grew a couple of acres that we planted in the spring, and we actually turned around and cleaned it right away and planted another couple acres in September, because we had, through our research and talking to a few people more familiar than us, said that einkorn in particular can be facultative in the right area, which means that you can either plant it in the fall and it will vernalize and overwinter, or you can plant it as a spring grain. And just between, not having to get out there and try to plant in the first week of April in a wet spring, and the jump in weed control that the fall planted cereals get, anytime that we can plant something in the fall on our farm, we try to do it. So I can certainly report back. The stuff is green under the snow right now, but we'll see in the spring how it pulls through winter. This is that same field of einkorn. We ended up swathing it with just a little 10, you can see off in the distance, there's a 10-foot John Deere swather there. It was quite a bit. Our other swather's 21 feet, and just in the interest of trying to get it to dry down more quickly, sometimes we use the smaller swather just to get the windrows dried down a little more quickly. This is our field of turkey red wheat from this summer. You can see again, it has that same condition of kind of not lodging exactly, but certainly tumbling over into this kind of matrix that makes it almost impossible to walk through the field. But it makes beautiful straw. It yielded, about, I want to say 28 to 30 bushels the acre, which is about the tops we've had on turkey red. Usually it's around 25 to 30. Both that and the red fife, those yields seem to be pretty consistent. And this was, you could kind of see this in Steve's data too. One interesting thing is the yield, on the high end, the yield potential isn't as high as the modern wheats, but in a year of stress, they tend to take less of a dive in performance and yield than the modern varieties do. So in years, and I can't remember which year it was now, but we had one really hot year in the last few where our spring wheat, I think it was bowls at the time, probably yielded half of what we're typically used to. But the red fife and turkey red, we're just chugging along at 25 bushel, which again is nothing to brag about from a straight yield perspective, but because we're direct marketing it and we have a market for it, we can get enough of a premium price to make it worth it. We do, getting a little bit more into just our farm management, we do swath almost everything that we plant in the spring. That tends to be how the decision, there are certain weed conditions where we'll derivate, or if we can get out early enough, we might be able to skip swathing on the spring grains. And part of that is because we're always underseeding our spring grains, even the Emmer with either alfalfa or medium red clover. So there's inevitably, the foxtail and other broadleaf weeds that'll kind of get going once the wheat starts to senesce, plus the alfalfa and red clover underseeding make it a lot kinder on the combine if you can lay the grain in a swath a day or two. But fall grains we tend to direct cut. We, in the last couple of years, also invested in a tine weeder. So this is the first tine weeding on spring wheat. I believe this was 2019. And you can see we're really burying the wheat, but it grows right back and grows right through that. And if you have mustards or early broadleaf weeds in your system, it really helps to clean up that small grain crop. We have an air seeder on our tine weeder, so on our last tine weeding pass, we're able to still seed that alfalfa or red clover on the last trip through the field with the tine weeder. And then this is sort of the inevitable point you reach when, we have the cattle, but they're grass fed entirely, so they don't feed any grain. So we can, in small situations, if we have a train wreck in the field, we've been able to make baleage or something like that to avoid taking a crop to grain. But generally speaking, any small grain we grow, we have to combine the grain and try to sell it that way. We do have some organic hog and poultry farmers that will buy feed grains from us, but for the most part, we're relying on direct marketing to food grade, either by selling it, through our mill directly to commercial bakers, distillers, restaurants, things like that, or to other mills in the area. So a lot of the work we do, really, the harvest day is about the midpoint in the journey, and honestly, probably a little bit short of the midpoint in terms of the hours and blood, sweat, and tears that go into getting the grain off the farm and sold. We always pre-clean grain. Almost all of our grain, actually, I would say in the 5 years, 6 years I've been on this farm, we've never sold a load of grain off the farm right off the combine. Everything has come back to the farm and at least been cleaned and dried. It involves a good amount of time and investment in managing grain in bins and cleaning bins yearly, and certainly cleaning grain, but making that investment in the infrastructure really has allowed us to still make food grade with crops that maybe right off the combine wouldn't have quite made the cut, either because they have a little bit elevated vomitoxin, or the dockage would have been a little bit too high, or the moisture was a little bit too high. We find it's better to, especially with wheat, and when you're trying to preserve things like a high falling number, if you have rain coming, it's better if you're able to get it off, even if it's 17, 18% moisture, and bin dry it, than to have to wait till it's, 13, 14%, and have it catch a lot of rain in July. So this is kind of going through the setup we have here. We usually either use a drum cleaner or this sort of drop through aspirator, which honestly, if I could have one or the other, I'd almost rather have this aspirator than the drum cleaner. It really does an incredible job of pulling out light material and fines, which really helps with bin drying. We have a continuous flow grain dryer, but you can see we hot rodded a bucket elevator onto it, which allows us to run this dryer as basically a recirculating batch dryer, which lets us dry at lower temperatures. So we can fill the dryer, run it at a low temperature, and then recirculate it through the leg back into the top of the dryer, which lets us do, open pollinated corn that we can actually dry cool enough for seed and food grade, which has been helpful.
Hey, John, there was a question asking about what open OP corn varieties do you grow on your farm?
That's a good question. We grow, the only one that you'd recognize is Bloody Butcher. The other ones we sort of inherited. There was a couple that retired that put together composites of a yellow-orange flint, a white dent, and a red flint corn. And those all have, the parentage of all of them are in all of the corn that you would find in, Wapsie Valley and Hickory King and everything like that. But at this point, we've been hand selecting these composite populations that they're really unique to our farm, which honestly, I recommend. We lucked into that, those genetics, and they've been, they haven't always done well. And we've had some down corn in October that's been pretty disheartening in the early years. But when you get away from, saying this is Bloody Butcher and trying to really, stay to a particular type, and instead focus on, we're trying to do an open pollinated white dent corn and bringing in more seed from other people's farms and trying to get as much diversity as you can and just make it delicious and do well on your farm. That's kind of, I've found a really liberating way to do open pollinated corn. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to market because people like those beautiful names, but if the corn quality is there, it'll speak for itself.
Awesome. Thanks for that.
Cool. This is a little bit in the weeds, just talking about different reasons why it's been good for us to have on-farm grain cleaning. Dehulling specifically, this is that same field of Sun Gold Spelt, and then on the upper right you can see spelt berries that we've dehulled, and then the spelt in the hull before it runs through the dehuller. Like Steve said, spelt, if you do grow it, make sure you have the bin and wagon space. It adds up in a hurry. It'll come off the field like it's yielding 120 to 150 bushels the acre, because it can be usually around 30-pound test weight, usually a couple pounds lighter than oats. So you'll fill up your trucks in a hurry with a few passes around the field and wonder where you're going to put it all. There is certain varieties will dehull a little bit better. If you tend to thresh really hard in the combine, you can say get 20, 30% to dehull. But as farmers that are then taking it back to the farm to dehull it, I'd rather thresh gently, keep all the grain in the hulls, have a larger volume of grain to store, but the grain really stores better in the hull. You don't have as much breakage and spoilage in the bin. So I've, rather than try to dehull as much as we can in the combine, we actually thresh really gently, just knock it off the straw and rely on our dehuller to do all of the work. The dehuller we have is an impact dehuller. It's called an S-House granulator. I don't know of anyone else that's using one. It wasn't even built to dehull grain, but we purchased it from Small Valley Milling, which is a family-run family farm in central Pennsylvania that does a lot of spelt, and they just sort of discovered that this machine would work. And when they upgraded to a Kodima, which is a sort of the state-of-the-art dehuller, I believe they're made in Minnesota, we were able to buy their old dehuller and use that. There's a dehuller that comes from Germany called a Horn, which is a bit more self-contained. I can't recall exactly how much they cost, but they have an aspirator and a circular gravity table built in so that you can just kind of plug those in and go. But for a lot of the dehullers, it's not that you have to build a whole system. And that's what these next pictures are kind of showing here, is that you have to have the dehuller, but then also an aspirator to pull the hulls off. And then you have to have some kind of machine. And a fanning mill is not quite good enough that will separate the clean spelt berries or Emmer or Einkorn berries from the broken ones. And most importantly, separate out the unsuccessful. And on our dehuller, that's usually, 20 to 40%, depending on the humidity of that grain that goes into our dehuller, is going to come back out still in the hull. And you have to be able to get that off of the stream of clean grain and recirculate that back through your dehuller as you're dehulling. And so this is a pretty dusty picture, but this shows kind of a little bit of the Rube Goldberg contraption we've got running, where we have our air screen cleaner on the right. The grain goes into a bucket elevator, up into the dehuller on a platform, through the aspirator, which is also on the platform that you saw on the previous slide. And then that grain goes down into the big blue machine on the bottom left, which is called a disc cylinder separator. And that separates by length. So we can get a fraction of, and this is the end of that machine here, the fraction that hasn't been dehulled goes into that green bucket elevator back up into the dehuller, and the clean spelt comes out the end, which is completely insane and has been, the equipment's come from 4 different states and took us a while to put it all together. So it can be done, and I'm happy to talk with anybody and troubleshoot what we've gone through to try to make it work. But it took us a few years to get to this point. And as you can see from our spelt berries, it's still not perfect. We still get a few, especially from the tip of the spike. There tend to be smaller spelt kernels that even in the hull are about the same length. So they tend to get in with the spelt berries. So the next iterative step for us is probably a patty table once we get one on the farm, and that'll help really get us around the last corner to making really nice clean spelt berries. If you're grinding flour, this is certainly good enough, but we're trying to get to a place where we can sell the berries to chefs or to a food co-op to go in a bulk bin. And once it goes behind that glass, you really want it to be sparkling clean. So that I wanted to, just have those pictures of our dehuller set up in there. I'm sure it was probably pretty incomprehensible. But if anyone is interested in talking more about it, I'm certainly happy to. This is just kind of in conclusion, and really the focus with these grains agronomically, they're not that different than growing modern varieties. The fertility requirements, I think, in general tend to be a bit lower because they have a more substantial root structure, and they're better at scavenging, and they're better at dealing with drought and because there's more built-in diversity to the genetics, they tend to, like I said, kind of just keep chugging along and not necessarily go through the same stresses that a modern variety would. But your trade-off there is obviously you have to make sure that you have your markets and your relationships lined up on the back end so that you're not selling the grain for feed, because the yields just aren't there to pencil out one for one with modern varieties in a typical year. So that's what I've got. I'm happy to keep chatting and answer any questions. I haven't been able to look at the chat really because it's weird being on the phone, but
Yeah, no sweat. I've got that under control. Thank you, John, for that presentation and for sharing your experience with those grains. That was really illuminating to me. I know there's a couple of historical questions that came up here. So do you have any issues with cross-pollination on your multiple different winter rye varieties? I might just add that with the hybrid ryes, they are able to cross-pollinate, but they also produce a ton more pollen than open pollinated varieties. So cross-pollination, it can happen, but it's probably not as big of an issue there. But what's been your experience?
Yeah, we've not. I certainly, the first year we grew Danko, we had a rustic in the vicinity, and I definitely saw it, the genetic influence of it in the next year's crop, which wasn't ideal because I didn't really, I preferred the Danko genetics the way they were. So I think growing multiple varieties of rye, you do want to have that isolation if you're saving seed. Yeah, certainly. I mean, with the other wheats, they're not entirely self-pollinating, but basically, so you don't really have to worry about it as much, though Steve would be a better authority on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll unmute Steve here in case he wants to chime in. But there, you kind of sighed a little bit of talking about hulless oats. Maybe you can fill us in a little bit about that too, because that, I suppose we would consider that more of a specialty grain as well, in terms of the stuff that we carry.
Yeah, we grew them because we were trying to find an end around to being able to sell rolled oats. And again, we're just literally doing raw rolled oats and not steam treating them. So that's another whole marketing challenge because they're really perishable in that state. So you have to treat them like refrigerated or frozen. And no one's in a grocery store setting is going to look into the refrigerator or the freezer for their oats. So that's the other sort of strike against doing it. But we just found that the yields were, they look nice in the field, but the yields just weren't there, and the percent dehulled wasn't great. And they're really, generally speak, there is one variety from Canada called AC Gale, which is supposed to be a lot less irritating in the skin, like a lot less physically hairy than the American hulless oat varieties, but that's a big consideration. Handling hulless oats is a really itchy proposition. Mm-hmm. So after 3 years of doing it, at this point, we've grown Streaker and Paul, which is an older variety, I think out of the same breeding program as Streaker. Mm-hmm. And then we tried to grow Gale, but the seed didn't germ well. So the jury's out on that. But at this point, we're investing in an oat dehulling setup so that we can grow, sumo oats and dehull them. But we're still working out the details on that. So it can be done, but it's, I would recommend, the one thing that kind of saved it is we have a debearder on our farm. If you run those hulless oats through a debearder, then they're in pretty good shape for rolling if you're trying to do direct market the way we are. But without something to kind of, or run them through an auger a bunch of times or something to try to polish them up a little bit, certainly helps to prep them for rolling and get those last hulled ones out of the hulls. Yeah.
Thanks for mentioning that. I mean, important to know too, that for anybody that's looking to produce hulless oats is that they're not 100% hulless. You still have 5 to sometimes 20% upwards of hulled grain in the tank, even though you're producing that. And I mentioned this earlier in the comments, but those really are for kind of specialty uses. A lot of large scale oat milling markets don't like hulless oats because they process differently than hulled oats that have been dehulled. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking through.
Another reason why they don't like them too on larger scale is because of the oil content.
Yeah, they really don't store well, in my experience. Like even before you roll them, they tend to, unless you got refrigerated storage, they don't keep more than 6-9 months before they start to kind of go off, in my experience.
Gotcha.
And to back up on the one question you had, Matt, about the distances on pollination on rye, I'm not sure if I remember right, but I think even for foundation seed in North Dakota, I think we're 800 feet. So the distances aren't as great as one would think.
Gotcha. That's good information to know. So it's not like you have to have a tree line and 2 miles between seed fields or something.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
No, and again, I hope I'm right on that number, but like I said, it's not as much as we think. Now, there's different standards for different states or different, entities that put out these recommendations too for pollination. But
Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a good question as we're taking a couple minutes here, since we started a few minutes late. But there's a question about what would be the best, smallest piece of equipment to invest in? I'm assuming to kind of handle some of these more specialty grains, or just to deal with small grains in general. If maybe either of you had any perspectives on that.
I still think at the core of it is a fanning mill. I know if your farm is in a scale where, like, our fanning mill is a 4-screen fanning mill with a top and bottom air, which is basically that there's a point of aspiration when the grain enters the machine and then when it leaves. If it's not even so much that those machines are expensive, they're just hard to come by, and you have to sort of be willing to rebuild them if you're on a budget. But even a Clipper 27 or a smaller cleaner, like a 2-screen cleaner, can work. And if you're dealing with smaller lots of grain, you can always change screens and do multiple passes and be creative without having to do a tremendous amount of work. One thing I will say is that aspiration in general just does an incredible job of cleaning up grain, and that doesn't have to be done. We have a fractionating aspirator and that sort of drop through aspirator that we use for pre-cleaning before grain goes into a bin. But even just winnowing grain with a fan when you're taking it from wagons to augers and things like that can be really helpful too, at pretty low cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know some of the folks in the milling industry that I've talked to is that, yeah, it's very possible to raise your quality and test weight by doing a little bit of, fanning before you, either when you load a bin or unload it. You can add a couple points to test weight, maybe get rid of some lights or, disease.
Definitely.
Like that. Definitely a good investment if you're looking
and you definitely, when you tend to, in my experience, you have to be willing to, in running the fans and equipment and stuff, you have to be willing to break some eggs, to get the light fraction out to clean wheat to a point where a miller or a baker is really going to be excited about using it. You really want to have really plump grain. And so, sometimes that means 10, 15%, depending on if I have a vomit toxin issue, or 15 is kind of high. That would be if there's a vomit toxin problem. But often between 5 and 10%, I'm pretty aggressive when I clean grain to make sure that what's ending up in the clean grain is really consistent and high quality. And that does mean some good grain going into the, chicken feed. But I think for us, it's been worth it to clean aggressively.
Do you have any feedback on screen size that you use for small grains in your rotary cleaner?
I can't recall off the top of my head. I mean, it's annoying enough to change the screens out on those that we've at this point accumulated 2 or 3, I think 3 drum cleaners that we just have, one set up for wheat, one set up for oats, and one set up for corn and beans, and we never really change them. But the screen, it's basically hardware cloth, but it can be kind of expensive to change a set of screens for those cleaners. So I can't recall exactly, but there's charts out there, and that's all we did is we found, a chart from I think we had a Farm King cleaner and found a manual online somewhere, and they had a list of different hardware cloth sizes, recommendations for different grains.
Gotcha. There's a couple other questions here, but I think in the interest of time, we're going to conclude the program. Just want to say thanks again to John and Steve. Maybe if you wouldn't mind dropping, if you are okay with it, if you drop your contact info. There's a question on buckwheat hulling. We're not going to open that can of worms today, but
another day.
Drop your contact info and we can follow up online. But I just want to say thank you again to all of our speakers. Thanks to everyone as well who joined us today for the presentation. Again, if you missed any portion of the program today, we will be archiving these and putting them up on the web. So look for those on our website. I posted the link earlier in the day where those are going to show up on our website. But thanks very much. Hope everyone stays safe and healthy the rest of this winter and has a great farming season this spring.